NVIDIA's RTX 3000 series GPUs were officially announced today, and now we have first-party information from NVIDIA to go over with a news story on NVIDIA's live stream announcement of its cards and some additional thoughts on things like the cooler design. There's a lot to go through today, so let's get straight into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So this includes news on the cooler design. There's a bit of power design information as far as the PCB goes, that is. There's information on the hard specs of the devices, some early and somewhat useful charts that obviously they're first party, so they're limited usefulness, but showing NVIDIA's positioning of the 3000 series versus its previous generations from the 10 series and the 20 series. We need to do some of our own testing on this to validate the claims, but so far it looks like the biggest takeaway is that NVIDIA is really trying to bury the 1080 Ti, something we tweeted out about during the middle of their stream. So we'll start with the pricing and the specs, so everyone wants to know. The RTX 3080 will launch at the same price as the 2080 at $700 MSRP from NVIDIA's site, and around September 17th for partner model availability, or at least purchasing availability. The RTX 3090 will launch at $1,500 on September 24th. The RTX 3070, meanwhile, will launch for $500 in October. And positionally, again, NVIDIA is trying really hard to kill its 1080 Ti because Jensen Huang in the keynote stated, quote, "To my Pascal friends, it's safe to upgrade now." Turing barely got a mention in this segment. In fact, Turing was actually removed from some of the charts for a couple of minutes in the presentation so that NVIDIA could really emphasize its first-party reported gap between the 1080 Ti and the 20 series. And when it was doing this, we'll point out a few things. First of all, the gap was made to look a bit bigger in some of the charts because the 3000 series had ray tracing on RTX enabled and DLSS enabled, whereas the 10 series, if you look at the footnotes, obviously, DLSS not available on that card. Not news to anyone, but that being removed plus forcing RT on for the devices does make the 10 series positioned worse. What we don't know right now firmly is the rasterization relative performance between the two. In other words, if you don't care about things with RTX, or if you're only playing games that don't have RTX, then rasterization is what we would really want to know to answer your use case of if you should upgrade or not. That said, RTX is clearly getting a lot more push and will likely only become increasingly relevant in at least this generation. So the importance of it may start to shift to be on the higher end. The somewhat maybe useful marketing chart has an arbitrary set of language where it's got a y-axis that has the same number, 60 FPS, but the resolution changes. So this is actually not at all to scale. But anyway, it says the 1080 Ti is doing about 1440p 60 FPS, or over 60 FPS actually, while the 3080 RT on is doing 60 FPS and over 4K. So wait for our own testing to see how that goes. Let's get back into the specs though. The RTX 3070 claims to be faster than the 2080 Ti at $500 with a launch date in October. It will have 8 gigabytes of GDDR6, not 6X, according to the presentation. It claims 20 shader teraflops, 40 RT, and then 163 for tensorflops. But we need to look at the other specifications, which we will in a second, beyond the flops numbers, because those are of limited usefulness. Here's the spec table. The RTX 3090 is running 10,496 CUDA cores, the 3080 running 8704, the 3070 running 5888 for CUDA cores, as NVIDIA calls them. Boost clocks are listed at 1.7 gigahertz or 1700 megahertz on the 3090, 1710 on the 3080, and 1730 on the 3070. Memory config is 24 gigabytes at G6X for the 3090, 10 gigabytes G6X for the 3080, and 8 gigabytes G6 non-X for the 3070. We'll talk about GDDR6X more in a little bit. Memory interface width is 384 bits for 3090, 320 for 3080, and 256 for the 3070. You might notice in the spec table that it does say 2 8-pins for some of these, 1 8-pin for the others. If you're wondering what happened to the 12-pin, well, that wasn't just a rumor. NVIDIA's actually shown the 12-pin, so it is happening. And what is almost certainly happening is a conversion, so it's probably a 2x8 into 12. We'll find out more when we can actually physically see the card and not just renders, but that's what we would assume makes sense, is a 2x8 into 12 conversion, because there's already Seasonic making microfit connectors for adapting anyway, so that would make sense. And then RT cores have moved, as have tensor cores, to a new generation, but we don't have full architecture day details yet on what precisely those changes are. That's something that NVIDIA will be providing to us in the next couple of days, though. NVIDIA also has listed all the way down a bunch of yeses for various things like Ansel, Freestyle, Shadowplay, things that you wouldn't expect would be absent from any of these. However, there's one hidden in the middle there. That's NVLink and SLI readiness. There is yes listed for the 3090, while the 3080 and 3070 simply have a dash. We would assume that means no. So this is actually really interesting. It's kind of like the PCIe device shift we saw in AMD on the CPU side, where suddenly the cheapest Threadripper part became much more expensive and the 3950X entered into play, but dropped a lot of things that the cheap Threadripper parts had, like affordable PCIe lanes. In this instance, potentially it sounds like multi-device readiness, insofar as them communicating with each other via a bridge, might be shifting only to the $1,500 card. That is assuming that dash means no. If NVIDIA is a little bit afraid to say no for those devices, then we'll find out if maybe there's a connector on some versions of the card. But it really sounds like right now 3090 is the one you would have to go to for that. So it's really shifting that specific use case up to the professional market and forcing a more expensive purchase. I have to go grab some video cards, because the next thing we're going to look at is the sizing. We don't have the reference board here yet, but a lot of people were worried about the size of the card and case compatibility, which was going way overboard in some instances. An FTW3 1080 Ti is approximately 12 inches across and approximately, let's measure from the slot, it's going to be 5 point maybe 7 or so inches tall. Sorry, we'll maybe put millimeters on the screen for you, but that's what my tape measure reads in. So the reference card for the 3090 claims to be a 12.3 inch or 313 millimeter by 5.4 inch or 138 millimeter sizing. That is then not significantly larger than aftermarket cards that you could have purchased previously. So not as scary large as people were saying on the internet, but we'll see when we get it in if there are any other problems. The cooler is going to be the most interesting aspect here. Graphics card power is listed at 350 watts, 320 watts, and 220 watts for the 3090, 3080, and 3070. And this is why we weren't reporting on some of the power rumors, because they were starting to get ridiculous. Other big hardware level claims right now, the RTX 3080 is claiming to be the new flagship, decidedly leaving the 3090 out of that discussion, which again, aligns with NVIDIA pushing the 3090 more to Titan class, so you shouldn't be viewing the 3090 as a 1080 Ti or as a 2080 Ti. You should be viewing it as a Titan class card with a different name. And the 3080, as we said, will be $700, so that positions it around where the 1080 Ti was priced for a while anyway. Thus far, we know that NVIDIA is claiming a 1.9x performance per watt improvement in terms of power, and for actual power consumption, we'll test that and validate it once we get the cards in. For ray tracing performance, NVIDIA is dunking on Turing in one of its charts, where it shows Turing as a baseline 1.0x. Ampere is showing about a 60 to 100% uplift with Blender cycles, Autodesk Arnold, and V-Ray for rendering. It's also, we're not 100% sure if they're doing rendering tile by tile or if they're doing real-time ray tracing or path tracing, but we'll have to find out. It's also showing gains in the 50% and up range for gaming applications, including Minecraft RTX that we recently tested. Now, that said, that's with ray tracing enabled, so again, if RT doesn't matter to you, the gains may be different for rasterization only. We'll have to see. Then the final notes for this section before we move into the cooling section, it is a new Ampere GPU, so Ampere is supposed to include 2nd gen RTX. We'll find out what exactly that is later. 28 billion transistors at the peak of Ampere, Samsung 8 nanometer process, customized by NVIDIA apparently. And then also the last bit of information, Ampere does 2 shader calculations per clock versus 1 on Turing, and that's where some of the numbers we're seeing are coming to play with regard to the teraflop performance that NVIDIA reported. So this is all, we'll get more into the architecture later. We need to go through the actual architecture day with NVIDIA. We haven't done that yet at this point. Typically by now we've already done that, but because of the way global travel works, it didn't happen this time. Let's get into the cooling and power design. So the most interesting aspect, honestly, with this set of cards to us is the cooler design and the power side of things. From a testing standpoint, the cooler design is very unique, and NVIDIA published a rendered explosion of its design. In that rendering, it shows a backplate that should hopefully make use of thermal pads to leverage the area. It then has the PCB, which is cut down in size. It's got a set of heat pipes. It looks like maybe 4 flat pipes in the render, but that might just be the art. And then those round out towards the end. After this, there are 2 separate fin stacks that look to be taller in size. We couldn't get a good read in the presentation on the PCIe slot width for each card. And then those are bridged by heat pipes in between. And after that, it's just the shroud, obviously. We noticed on at least the 3070 that the power connector is in the center of the card. NVIDIA did this on the 2060 FE as well. And the design was absolutely atrocious to dismantle. So we really hope NVIDIA's mechanical engineers have improved on this time and made it so that you can actually take apart the 3070, so it's not like a 2060 where it's basically a throwaway product if a fan stops spinning. We'll see, though, how that turned out this time. Claims. NVIDIA claims, quote, 55% more airflow. This is something we can validate with, with the tools we have here. They claim 3 times quieter. We should expand on this in a moment. They claim 30% more efficient. With regard to 3 times quieter, this is sort of a thing you can do, but noise is difficult because multiples of volume subjectively, which is the only thing that will ultimately matter, is a very hard thing to quantify. And you can sort of approximate things, but you get into discussion of, are you talking acoustic power, like dB, or are you talking about perceived noise to the human ear? Perceived noise to the human ear in NVIDIA's reviewer guides, it claims that approximately a 10 dBA change in noise is perceived to the human ear to be about a 2 times increase in noise if you go from, say, 30 to 40. But and then that's different from acoustic power, where you start looking at things as low as maybe 3 decibels, depending on what you're talking about. So 3 times, we don't really like that metric for demonstrating volume when talking about a product, because it just sort of, it doesn't mean it. Also, when you go multiples but in a smaller direction, that's gets super screwy with marketing math. So anyway, we'll talk more about that once we get the cards. As far as the cooler design, there's 2 fans on there. One's on the back side, and that fan is pulling air through the front of the card, which we're going to call this the front of the card, where the fans traditionally would be, and blowing through the back. Now, the back has a truncated PCB, you'll see in their renders, and also no backplate covering the section where the fan's pushing through. This is not the first time we've seen a fan push through a cooler, but a lot of the partners have put a backplate behind it, which sort of eliminates the purpose. So NVIDIA's got it actually designed properly in the sense that the air is going straight through it, or getting pulled straight through it in this case, because it's on the other side. The warm air will go through the fan, to make that very clear, and then into a CPU tower cooler, if you have one, in a standard ATX computer configuration. So this gets extremely interesting, because we happen to be tooled up for cooler testing, and now the air versus liquid argument will change even further. And suddenly you've got a CPU tower cooler that will have to deal with an effective higher ambient temperature at the entrance of the cooler because of the GPU exhaust straight into it. So we'll see how, that's what, personally speaking, I'm the most interested in testing. We're gonna go really deep with that testing and get you the metrics on it. There may be a change in the efficacy of tower coolers and their ability to deal with that extra heat, because it's effectively raising the ambient temperature. So if you had previously, let's say, case ambient temperature of maybe 30, cases aren't great, 30 degrees Celsius. If you have a room ambient of 21, a case ambient of 30 is actually pretty damn good under full load. So if you have a case ambient of 30 and now you're dumping the GPU heat straight into the cooler, maybe that increases to something like 35 C. So your temperature you will see on the CPU will increase, because the cooler is dealing with, it's got a higher baseline from ambient to bring down to, and therefore can't go as low. The floor has increased, in other words. So this will be really interesting to look at. Liquid coolers may suddenly have a different type of advantage that we hadn't really considered previously, in that they're going to be positioned further away and will potentially give some time for the rear exhaust fan in a standard case to deal with the heat, while the liquid cooler's also got liquid in it, so it has more time to soak. It takes maybe like 90 seconds for the average Air cooler, big air cooler to soak a 200-watt load, whereas a liquid cooler is in the range of 300 for the larger size ones. We've got all that in our charts for cooler reviews. So that'll be super interesting to look at. We wanted to add one clarifying note here about the coolers too, which is that a lot of people online are talking about how the reference design is exhausting heat into the CPU cooler. The other fan's pushing it out of the case, mind you, but more importantly, there will still be partner models. Those are going to be traditionally designed. They'll look like most of the partner cards have always looked. So if you don't like the reference model design, then the partner models will be the ones to keep an eye out for. Before we get into the latency discussion next, the power design, which is part of the cooler section, the reference PCB is compact to fit the cooler. It's cut to size. It will be running an 18-phase overall design. Some of that includes memory phases. We'll get the cards and probe it to figure out which exactly is which. And the VRM flanks the memory modules on either side, so we have a few suspicions about where hotspots will arise contingent upon that. The memory modules are oriented so that 4 are left of the GPU, 4 are right of the GPU, 3 are above it, and 1 is below it in the full, well, in the teardown model they showed us in the render anyway. And we can see the VRM flanking that, obviously. All right, latency discussion. There's a big push for latency. This is something where there's 2 angles to this. One is that NVIDIA is working with partners to bring 360 hertz displays to market, and these are G-Sync displays as well. NVIDIA is introducing software, it's software it looks like, called NVIDIA Reflex, which it claims will improve reaction time of the player. It showed this with Valorant, Destiny 2, and Fortnite, but the intention is that your total system end-to-end latency, we think, is probably the metric they were talking about, will be brought down for using NVIDIA Reflex. And we obviously need to work more with this, because right now it's not 100% clear what exactly that software is going to do. But definitely a big push on latency. Some of this is partly because of FPS, because if rasterization performance has skyrocketed or something to the point where it's going to be hard to market to gamers of why you should get something that can run their game at 400 FPS instead of 200 FPS or similar, then latency will be the key argument there, because at some point people are like, well, I mean, my monitor is 240 and that's already pretty good. What do I need 400 frames for? At some point, it's just ridiculous. Come on. So to address that, it's probably going to be a latency discussion, because that's where you're going to see the change more. Finally, final section for the news announcement, ray tracing, RTX Broadcast, and similar features. This is going to be a quick section. So first of all, Marbles was shown again. This was shown at GTC with NVIDIA, where their thumbnail showed ray tracing behaving more appropriately than it did in the actual demo, but it's back now. This time there's no rasterization. It's 100% real time. It's all path traced. They showed off new lighting effects, specifically calling out aerial and spherical lighting. No pre-baking at all in the demo, which means that nothing was pre-rendered. The lights were not pre-calculated, which you can do in the engine to effectively fake lighting, which is what developers have done for decades now. And they claim everything's dynamic. The dynamism here pointed towards diffuse global illumination. You can see that with the marbles rolling around. They talked about volumetric rendering in real time, things like that. So that demo's out there. Also, NVIDIA is focusing on its broadcast solution. This is what RTX Voice became. It rolled into Broadcast, if you're wondering where that went. So Broadcast also introduces things like a green screening effect, where without a green screen, it will trace you and presumably your chair and attempt to ultra key out the background in a sense. It looks pretty good from a few of the demos that they did. These are controlled demos, obviously. The room is a known level of chaos versus gamer room backgrounds where it's an unknown level of chaos. So we'll have to see how that scales. There were some issues with some of the green screen backgrounds where when the NVIDIA employee was full screen rather than picture-in-picture, we noticed significantly more feathering around the edges of his arms, for example, his shirt, stuff like that. So that's something to think about, but it's one of the things NVIDIA is trying to introduce more of, which is streamer-targeted utilities. And alongside this, they were showing off like a blurry background effect as well, which looked actually a little bit better than the fake green screen one. Okay, and then finally, NVIDIA thinks machinima is new. It talked about new forms of making movies with video games called machinima. We would really like to see the filmed reaction of Jensen Huang watches Red vs. Blue for the first time, because they've probably got a few things to say over at Rooster Teeth. This was interesting though. So NVIDIA Omniverse Machinima was the angle, the product. It has game libraries. It can do AI pose simulation or estimation to pose characters based on webcam shots of effectively an actor without, it looked like, any mocap technology, so that's kind of neat. Effects like particles and fluids were in there, and it's supposed to come out in beta in October. So it kind of reminds us of Ansel, where it's kind of a neat thing that a few people will use, but this isn't a wide market thing. So the main news then is the 3070 is in October. The 3090 is September 24th. The 3080 is September 17th, it looks like. The pricing is $700 for the 3080, $1,500 for the 3090, and $500 for the 3070, with the specs discussed herein. But we're, again, most interested in cooler testing, so that's where it'll get really fun. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more to make sure you catch our follow-up coverage. There will be a lot of it. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for behind-the-scenes footage, or store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up one of our wireframe mouse mats or our medium mod mats, both of which are in stock and shipping now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.